The year is 1314, and the air of the Scottish Highlands carries that cold, damp breath that seeps into armor and bone alike. Mist rolls slowly over the hills like a living thing, drifting across forests and marshland, swallowing distant shapes until the world becomes nothing but shadows and silence. Somewhere in that gray wilderness stands an army that, by every measure of logic, should not exist. 6,000 men, farmers, hunters, shepherds, blacksmiths, and a few hardened warriors. Many wear patched armor. Some carry shields that have been repaired so many times they barely resemble the originals, and others hold spears made from farm tools sharpened for war. They are hungry, tired, and outnumbered, yet they stand, because marching toward them from the south is something far more terrifying. An army nearly 4 times their size, 20,000 English soldiers, knights wrapped in iron, mounted on massive war horses bred to crush men beneath their hooves. Thousands of infantry with proper weapons and training. And among them, one of the most feared weapons in medieval Europe, the Welsh longbowmen, archers capable of sending arrows screaming through the sky with such force that even armored knights could be brought down on paper. This should not even be a battle. It should be a slaughter. But history has a strange habit of ignoring what is supposed to happen to understand why these two armies are about to collide here, on a narrow strip of land near a small stream called the Bannockburn. We have to travel back several years, to a time when Scotland itself seemed already defeated. For generations, Scotland had been a proud and fiercely independent kingdom, its clans scattered across rugged mountains, dense forests, and windswept glens. The land itself was a natural fortress. Harsh winters, steep terrain, and endless miles of wilderness made it nearly impossible for foreign armies to control. But even the toughest lands can fall when power and ambition come knocking, and few men embodied power and ambition like King Edward I of England. Edward was not merely a king. He was a conqueror. Tall, imposing, and relentless, he had earned a nickname that echoed across Britain like thunder, the Hammer of the Scots. Edward believed Scotland should belong to England, not as an ally, not as a neighboring kingdom, but as a possession, and so he marched north one by one. Scottish nobles were forced to bend the knee. Some submitted willingly, hoping to preserve their lands and titles. Others resisted and paid for it dearly. Castles were seized, rebellions crushed, entire families stripped of power. Anyone who refused loyalty to the English crown was treated not as an enemy noble, but as a traitor, and traitors, in Edward's eyes, deserved no mercy. One man tried to stand against him. William Wallace. Wallace became a legend almost overnight, a towering figure who rallied Scottish fighters into rebellion, striking English forces in daring attacks, and even achieving an astonishing victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297. For a moment, it looked as though Scotland might rise again, but legends often burn bright and fast. Eventually, Wallace was captured, and Edward made sure his fate would be remembered forever. In 1305, Wallace was dragged to London, publicly executed in one of the most brutal ways imaginable. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered. His body was cut into pieces, displayed across England as a warning to anyone who might think about rebellion. The message was clear. Scotland belonged to England now. Many believe the struggle was over, but history rarely ends when people think it does, because while Wallace had been the sword of Scottish resistance, another figure was quietly stepping into the shadows of history. A man who would become something far more dangerous to the English crown. His name was Robert the Bruce. Bruce was not some wandering rebel or common warrior. He was a nobleman, a man with bloodlines tied to the Scottish throne itself. His family had long held claims to kingship, and in the chaos of English occupation, those claims suddenly carried enormous weight. But Robert the Bruce was not immediately the hero that later generations would celebrate. First, he was cautious. Some even called him opportunistic. In those early years of English dominance, survival often required playing both sides. Bruce sometimes cooperated with the English, sometimes supported Scottish resistance. It was a dangerous balancing act, and many questioned where his true loyalties lay. That question would be answered in the most dramatic way imaginable. In 1306, Bruce met with a rival noble named John Comyn inside a church in Dumfries. Comyn had his own claim to the Scottish crown and had begun working with the English. Tensions between the two men had been building for years. What happened next would change the course of history. Inside that church, beneath the gaze of the altar itself, Robert the Bruce drew a dagger and stabbed John Comyn. Murder inside a church was not just a crime. It was a sacrilege, a sin so grave that it shook the entire medieval world. The news spread like wildfire. Bruce had killed a rival noble in the house of God itself. There was no going back now. Within weeks, Bruce made the most audacious decision imaginable. He crowned himself King of Scotland. The reaction across Europe was almost laughter at a king. Of what exactly? Scotland was under English control. Its castles were garrisoned by English soldiers. Its nobles divided. The church excommunicated Bruce for the murder in the church, and Edward I immediately declared him an outlaw. Robert the Bruce had a crown, but no kingdom. Most men in his position would have fled, disappeared into exile somewhere across the sea. Bruce did the opposite, that he chose to fight, and those early years were brutal beyond imagination. English forces hunted him relentlessly. His supporters were captured and executed. His own family members were imprisoned in cages. At times, Bruce was forced to flee into the wilderness with only a handful of followers, hiding in forests and remote islands just to survive. But something strange happened during those dark years. Instead of disappearing, Bruce began learning. He realized he could never defeat England in a traditional battle. England had more soldiers, more money, and stronger castles. Meeting them head-on would always end the same way. Bruce changed the rules. He turned the entire country into a battlefield. Instead of defending castles, he destroyed them so the English could not use them. Instead of marching large armies, he relied on small, fast groups that struck suddenly and vanished into the mountains. Roads became ambush points. Forests became hiding places. Supply lines were attacked. English patrols vanished in the night. It was not glorious warfare. It was relentless warfare. Year after year, the English grip on Scotland slowly weakened. Castle after castle fell back into Scottish hands. Garrisons were forced to retreat. English commanders began to realize they were not fighting an army. They were fighting a ghost that be why the year 1314, nearly 8 years after Bruce crowned himself king. The impossible had almost happened. Most of Scotland was free again, but one fortress still remained in English hands, and it was the most important fortress in the entire kingdom, Stirling Castle. Perched high above the land like a stone giant, watching over the countryside, Stirling controlled the main route between northern and southern Scotland. Whoever held Stirling controlled movement across the country itself. If the English kept Stirling, they could invade again whenever they wished. If the Scots captured it, England's power in Scotland would shatter. Bruce's brother, Edward Bruce, laid siege to the castle. For months, the Scots surrounded it, waiting for hunger and desperation to do what swords could not. Inside the walls, the English commander knew time was running out. Finally, a strange agreement was reached. If no English army arrived to relieve Stirling Castle by June 24th, 1314, the garrison would surrender the fortress to the Scots first. This might sound like a foolish deal for the Scots, because it gave England time to gather an army. But in truth, it was a trap, not for Scotland, for England. Because when the English king heard that Stirling Castle was about to fall, he had no choice that he had to respond. And so, across England, messengers began riding, summoning knights, calling soldiers, preparing one of the largest armies England had assembled in years, and marching north straight toward Robert the Bruce, toward the narrow fields beside a quiet stream called the Bannockburn, where 6,000 Scots were waiting, and where history was about to turn in a way no one expected. Across England, the message spread quickly, carried by riders who pushed their horses to exhaustion on muddy roads and narrow village paths. The king demanded men, not a small force to deal with some scattered rebels, but a great army, one that would end the Scottish problem once and for all. When the order came from King Edward II, it carried the weight of royal pride, and pride in medieval Europe could move mountains of steel. Edward II was not his father. His father, Edward I, had been a terrifying presence, a ruler whose ambition and discipline had earned him the name Hammer of the Scots. Edward II inherited the crown, but not the same fearsome reputation. Still, even a less formidable king commanded immense power, and England was a wealthy kingdom capable of raising armies that most European rulers could only dream about. Knights answered the call first. Armored nobles who owed military service to the crown gathered with their retinues, bringing squires, horses, and servants. Each knight was a walking fortress of steel, wearing armor that could take years to craft and cost a fortune. Their war horses were equally impressive, large animals trained not merely to carry riders, but to charge directly into enemy formations, smashing through lines of infantry like living battering rams. Behind them came the infantry. Thousands of foot soldiers armed with spears, swords, axes, and shields. Some were professional fighters, others were levies called up from towns and villages. They were used to following the banners of powerful nobles into battle, and many believed this campaign would be quick. After all, the Scots had spent years avoiding open battle. Surely once the English army appeared in full strength, the rebels would scatter as they always had. But perhaps the most dangerous part of the English army was not the knights, that it was the archers. 3,000 Welsh longbowmen marched with the army, carrying weapons that had already proven devastating across Europe. The longbow was not a delicate hunting bow. It was a powerful weapon that required years of practice to master. A trained archer could send arrow after arrow flying through the air with terrifying speed, and those arrows could punch through armor, especially at closer ranges. Entire battles have been decided by volleys of longbow fire. Together, this army formed a force of nearly 20,000 men. When it began marching north, it must have looked like a moving city of steel and banners stretching across the countryside. Villagers came out to watch as the columns passed. Armor glinted in the sunlight. Horses snorted and stamped against the earth. Trumpets echoed through valleys as nobles rode beneath their family colors. It was a display of power meant to remind everyone, friend or enemy, that England still ruled. The soldiers themselves were confident. Why wouldn't they be? They had the numbers. They had the equipment. They had the knights who dominated battlefields across Europe. And they believed they were marching to crush what remained of a fading rebellion. What they did not realize was that their enemy had been preparing for this exact moment for years. Far to the north, Robert the Bruce watched and waited. Bruce knew Stirling Castle had forced England's hand. By setting the deadline for June 24th, the Scots had guaranteed that the English would come. They had no choice. Allowing such an important fortress to fall without resistance would have humiliated the English crown and destroyed what little authority they still held over Scotland. But Bruce also understood something even more important. He could not win by fighting the English the way they expected. Open fields favored knights. Wide ground allowed cavalry to move freely, to charge and flank and break formations with raw power. If Bruce allowed the English army to deploy in such conditions, the Scots would be crushed. So he chose the battlefield with extraordinary care. South of Stirling lay a strange stretch of land shaped by rivers, woods, and marshes. A small stream called the Bannockburn twisted through the area, carving muddy banks and pools that made movement difficult. Nearby stood the dense woodland known as New Park, thick with trees and undergrowth. Between these natural barriers lay a relatively narrow strip of ground. It was not ideal for a large army, but it was perfect for a smaller one that understood the terrain. Bruce brought his army there and began transforming the landscape into a silent weapon. His men worked quietly but tirelessly. They dug hundreds, then thousands of small pits across key parts of the battlefield. Each hole was deep enough to trap a horse's leg. Then they covered them with branches, grass, and loose soil until they disappeared into the ground. To someone riding across the field at speed, the surface would look completely normal, until suddenly it wasn't. These hidden traps were designed for one purpose: to break the power of English cavalry. A charging warhorse was unstoppable when it had momentum, but if it stumbled even slightly, the entire charge collapsed into chaos. A knight thrown from the saddle could easily be crushed by the horses behind him or pinned helplessly in his heavy armor. Bruce was preparing to turn the English army's greatest strength into its greatest weakness. But terrain and traps alone would not win the battle. His soldiers needed discipline, and that meant training that S.O. Bruce focused on a formation that had already proven effective in earlier Scottish battles. The Schiltrons, at first glance, it looked simple. Groups of soldiers standing close together, each holding a long spear that could reach nearly 3 meters. But when formed properly, the Schiltron became something terrifying. Men stood shoulder to shoulder in tight circles or squares. Their spears pointed outward in every direction, forming a wall of sharp points. Anyone approaching would face dozens of spear tips before reaching the man behind them. From a distance, the formation almost resembled a giant metal hedgehog. For cavalry, this was a nightmare. Horses were powerful, but not suicidal. They would instinctively avoid charging straight into a forest of spears. And if riders forced them forward anyway, the result was often catastrophic. Horses impaled themselves, riders were thrown, and formations collapsed. Bruce drilled his men over and over again. Farmers became soldiers. Hunters learned to hold the line. The spears had to remain steady, the formation tight, no matter what came toward them. Meanwhile, scouts reported the English advance. The army was massive. Even Bruce's most experienced captains felt a chill when they heard the numbers. 20,000 men, thousands of knights, waves of infantry and archers. Against Bruce's 6,000, some might have expected fear to spread through the Scottish camp. But something strange was happening instead. For years these men had fought the English in smaller skirmishes. They had ambushed patrols, attacked garrisons, and watched the occupying forces slowly lose their grip on the country. Many of them had lived under English rule and knew what it meant. This battle was not simply about land or castles, that it was about whether Scotland would exist as its own kingdom at all. As the days passed and June approached, tension filled the air around Bannockburn. Scottish soldiers sharpened weapons, repaired shields, and whispered about the army marching toward them. Fires burned at night beneath the dark canopy of New Park Forest while sentries listened for distant movement. Then one day the scouts returned with the news everyone had been waiting for. The English army was close, very close. Dust clouds had appeared along the southern roads. Columns of soldiers stretching for miles. Knights riding ahead of the main force like armored giants. The invasion had arrived. Robert the Bruce gathered his commanders and spoke calmly about what would happen next. There would be no retreat, no more avoiding battle. The time for guerrilla warfare was over. Here, at Bannockburn, they would finally face the English army head-on. But they would do it on Bruce's terms. As evening approached on June 22nd, Scottish soldiers could see the glow of fires in the distance where the English camp had formed. Thousands of tiny lights flickering across the landscape, like a field of stars fallen to earth. Somewhere in that vast camp were the knights who believed tomorrow would bring easy victory. And somewhere among the Scots stood a king who believed tomorrow could change the fate of an entire nation. Neither side yet realized that the following day would produce one of the most famous moments in medieval warfare, a moment involving a single knight, a charging lance, and a king riding a small pony with. Nothing but an axe at a moment that would ignite the Scottish army with a roar that echoed across history. Morning crept slowly over the land near Bannockburn, and with it came a strange silence that often appears before great battles. The mist clung low to the ground, drifting across grass and marsh, softening the shapes of trees and distant hills. From within the forest of New Park, the Scottish army waited 6,000 men. They stood in loose formations among the trees, shields resting against their legs, spears planted into the earth. Some spoke quietly, others said nothing at all. Many were farmers who only months earlier had been working fields, tending animals, or repairing tools in small villages scattered across Scotland. Now they were soldiers about to face one of the most powerful armies in Europe. But if fear was present, it was hidden beneath something stronger, determination, because these men knew what defeat meant. English occupation, bon village, nobles forced to kneel, families torn apart by war. Many of them had already seen it with their own eyes during the long years of conflict as they waited. And then, slowly, the sound began. At first it was faint, almost like distant thunder rolling across hills far away. But as the hours passed, the noise grew clearer. Metal clinking against metal. Horses snorting. Voices echoing across the land. The unmistakable sound of a massive army on the move. The English had arrived. From the edges of the woods, Scottish scouts watched the columns appear along the southern approach to Stirling. The sight was breathtaking in scale. Rows of knights in shining armor rode at the front, banners fluttering above them in the breeze. Behind them came wave after wave of infantry, stretching across the landscape in numbers that seemed almost endless. Thousands of soldiers, and at their center rode King Edward II himself, surrounded by guards and nobles, confident that this campaign would end the Scottish rebellion once and for all. From a distance, the English army looked unstoppable. Armor gleamed beneath the sun. War horses stamped the earth impatiently. Trumpets sounded commands as commanders organized their forces. But the ground ahead of them was not the open battlefield they expected. Between the English army and Stirling Castle lay the land Robert the Bruce had chosen carefully. Narrow, uneven, broken by the twisting banks of the Bannockburn and bordered by the thick forest of New Park. It was not a place where a large army could move easily. Still, the English commanders were not particularly worried. They had seen the Scots retreat before. Many expected that once the English knights began their charge, the Scottish army would break and scatter just as smaller rebel forces had done in the past. Yet something unusual was happening. Instead of fleeing into the hills, the Scots were standing their ground. And even stranger, their king had ridden ahead of them. Robert the Bruce sat calmly on a small horse, a light pony rather than the massive war horses used by knights. He wore armor, but not the heavy plate favored by English nobles. In his hand, he carried a battle axe. From the English lines, the sight must have seemed almost ridiculous that the king riding a small pony out in front of his army, apparently exposed and vulnerable. Among the English knights watching this scene was a man named Henry de Bohun. Bohun was no ordinary soldier. He came from a powerful noble family and was considered a formidable warrior. When he spotted Robert the Bruce riding ahead of the Scottish forces, something immediately flashed through his mind. Opportunity. If he could kill the Scottish king in full view of both armies, the battle might end before it even truly began. The rebellion would collapse instantly without its leader. Glory, honor, and fame awaited the man who struck that blow. Without hesitation, de Bohun lowered his lance. His massive warhorse surged forward. Across the field, soldiers on both sides suddenly noticed what was happening. A fully armored English knight was charging directly toward the Scottish king. The thunder of hooves echoed across the ground as de Bohun accelerated. The lance aimed straight at Bruce's chest. A war horse at full charge was one of the most terrifying sights in medieval warfare. The combination of speed, weight, and steel could smash through infantry formations and crush enemies beneath its hooves. And Robert the Bruce was alone. Scottish soldiers watching from the forest felt their hearts stop. Some even shouted warnings, but it was too late. The knight was already rushing forward like a steel missile. Bruce did not run, but he simply turned his pony toward the charging knight. For a moment, it must have looked like madness that a small horse against a massive armored war horse, that a king with an axe against a knight with a lance. The distance between them closed rapidly. Bohun leaned forward, steadying his lance for the killing strike. At the last moment, just before the point could reach him, Robert the Bruce suddenly moved. His pony swerved sharply to the side. The lance missed. Bohun thundered past him in a blur of steel and horseflesh. And in that instant, Bruce rose in his stirrups. With perfect timing, he swung the battle axe downward with all his strength. The blade struck de Bohun's helmet. The impact was catastrophic. The axe smashed through the metal and split the knight's skull beneath it. The force of the blow was so powerful that the wooden handle shattered from the shock. Bohun collapsed instantly from his saddle, dead before he even touched the ground. For a heartbeat, the battlefield fell completely silent. Both armies had just witnessed the same unbelievable moment. Then the silence shattered. From the Scottish lines erupted a roar so loud it rolled across the hills like thunder. Their king had just killed one of England's proudest knights in single combat. In front of everyone, it was more than a victory, it was a message. Robert the Bruce rode calmly back toward his soldiers, still holding the broken handle of his axe. According to later stories, when he reached his commanders, they were not celebrating yet. Instead, one of them reportedly complained. Not because Bruce had killed the knight, but because he had broken his axe. The story may have been exaggerated over time, but the meaning was clear. Among the Scots, the moment strengthened something far more powerful than numbers or armor. Belief. If their king could face down one of England's finest knights and win, then perhaps the impossible victory ahead of them was not impossible after all. Meanwhile, in the English ranks, the mood had shifted. What should have been a simple display of dominance had suddenly turned into an embarrassment. One of their champions had fallen within seconds. And worse, he had been killed by the very man they were supposed to defeat. Night slowly approached as both armies settled into uneasy camps. The English commanders debated their next move. Some suggested caution. The terrain ahead looked dangerous and unfamiliar. Perhaps they should wait, reorganize, and choose better ground before attacking. But time was working against them. The deadline for Stirling Castle was the next day, June 24th. If the English army failed to break the Scottish forces and reach the castle by then, the fortress would surrender. King Edward II grew impatient. He had not marched 20,000 men across England just to sit and wait. As darkness fell over Bannockburn, he made a decision that would echo through history. At dawn, the English army would attack, straight into the narrow ground Bruce had prepared, and into the waiting wall of Scottish spears. Dawn on June 24th arrived slowly, the pale light creeping over the hills and filtering through the thick trees of New Park Forest. A thin mist hung above the ground near the Bannockburn, drifting across the uneven fields and marshy patches that lay between the two armies. For a few quiet moments the land seemed almost peaceful, as if unaware that within the next few hours it would become one of the most famous battlefields in medieval history. Inside the Scottish camp, soldiers were already awake. Many had barely slept. Some had spent the night whispering prayers, others sharpening spearheads or checking the leather straps that held their shields together. Fires burned low as men prepared for the day ahead. Somewhere in the trees a bird called, and for a brief moment the sound felt strangely normal. Then the horns began to sound from the English lines. Deep, echoing blasts rolled across the land, cutting through the quiet morning air. One by one, the soldiers of England began forming ranks. Knights mounted their enormous war horses, their armor clanking as they settled into saddles. Infantry gathered beneath their commanders' banners, forming long lines across the field. Archers moved into position, gripping their longbows as they waited for orders. The army of 20,000 men was waking up. Robert the Bruce moved calmly among his troops. He spoke to the commanders of his Schiltrons, reminding them of their training, their discipline, and the importance of holding their ground no matter what happened. The formations would have to move forward slowly, like giant living fortresses of spears. If they broke formation, they would die. If they held together, they might survive. The Scottish soldiers soon began forming their ranks. Hundreds of men packed tightly together, shields overlapping, spears angled forward like a forest of deadly spikes. The Schiltrons were not defensive circles this time. Bruce had trained them to advance slowly, pushing forward as a single body. From a distance, the formations looked like dark, bristling shapes moving across the field, and then something unexpected happened. Before the armies clashed, the Scots dropped to their knees. Across the field, thousands of Scottish soldiers bowed their heads and began to pray. English soldiers watching the scene began to laugh. Some shouted insults across the distance. From their perspective, it looked as though the Scots were begging for mercy, preparing for death before the battle, had even started. One English knight reportedly turned to King Edward II and said something along the lines of, "See, they kneel. They ask for forgiveness." But another nobleman watching carefully replied with a much colder observation, "They ask forgiveness from God, not from us." Because the Scots were not surrendering. They were preparing themselves for what was about to happen. Moments later, the horn sounded again. The English army began to move. As was tradition in medieval warfare, the heavy cavalry led the attack. Hundreds of knights lowered their lances as their war horses surged forward. The ground trembled beneath thousands of pounding hooves. Armor flashed beneath the morning sun as the riders accelerated into a full charge. This was the moment. English knights had been dominating battlefields for generations. Few infantry forces in Europe could stand against a charge like this. But the Scots did not run. The Schiltrons advanced slowly instead. Step by step, spears angled forward, men packed shoulder to shoulder. The gap between the two forces shrank rapidly. The thunder of hooves grew louder until it felt like the earth itself was shaking. Horses snorted and screamed as riders drove them onward. Then the charge hit. The first wave of English cavalry slammed directly into the wall of spears. What followed was chaos. War horses crashed into the forest of spear points. Some animals reared in terror, refusing to drive themselves onto the sharp tips. Others were forced forward by their riders and impaled themselves, collapsing in agony as knights were thrown violently to the ground. Behind them, more cavalry were still charging. They had too much momentum to stop. Horses collided with fallen animals. Riders crashed into one another. Lances snapped. Armor clanged as men struggled to stay upright in the growing pile of bodies and equipment. And beneath all of it, the Scottish formations kept pushing. The Schiltrons moved like enormous iron hedgehogs advancing across the field. Spears jabbed outward relentlessly. Knights who had fallen from their horses found themselves surrounded by dozens of spear points before they could even stand. Many were trapped by their own armor. A fully armored knight who fell to the ground could weigh well over 100 pounds with equipment. Getting up quickly in the middle of battle was nearly impossible. Some tried to crawl away. Most never made it. Meanwhile, the hidden traps Bruce's men had prepared began to do their work. Charging horses stumbled suddenly as their legs plunged into the concealed pits scattered across the battlefield. Riders were thrown violently forward. Entire sections of the cavalry line collapsed into confusion as horses tripped, crashed, and tangled with one another. The English attack was losing its shape. Still, the English army was massive, and more soldiers continued pushing forward. Infantry began entering the fight, pressing into the narrow strip of land between the Bannockburn and the forest. But that narrow ground quickly became a nightmare. Too many soldiers were trying to move through too little space. Men at the front were locked in desperate combat against the spear formations. Behind them, thousands more kept pushing forward, unable to see what was happening ahead. The pressure of bodies packed tightly together made movement almost impossible. The battlefield began to resemble a crushing human tide. Men shouted orders that were lost in the noise. Horses screamed as they collapsed beneath armored riders. Spears stabbed upward again and again. Shields splintered under the impact of weapons. And above it all, the Scottish formations continued to move forward, slowly, relentlessly. For the English soldiers trapped near the front lines, the situation was becoming terrifying. They could not move backward, they could barely move forward, and the wall of spears kept advancing. Meanwhile, the Welsh longbowmen finally tried to bring their deadly weapons into the fight. Archers began positioning themselves to fire volleys into the Scottish formations. If they could rain arrows into the dense Schiltrons, they might break the Scottish lines and give the cavalry room to maneuver again. But the battlefield was so narrow, and the armies so tightly packed together, that aiming became dangerously difficult. Arrows launched into the air began falling into a chaotic mix of English and Scottish soldiers. Some even struck English troops. Confusion spread quickly. And Robert the Bruce had been waiting for exactly this moment, because hidden behind the main Scottish lines was a small force that had not yet entered the battle. 500 light cavalry. They were not heavily armored knights like the English riders. Instead, they were fast, lightly equipped horsemen, perfect for sudden attacks. Bruce gave the order. The cavalry surged forward. They rode around the edges of the battlefield and crashed directly into the exposed English archers. The longbowmen had little protection. Without the support of the English knights, who were trapped in the chaos ahead, they were suddenly vulnerable. The attack shattered them. Archers began to scatter, abandoning their positions as the Scottish horsemen cut through their ranks. The one weapon that might have broken the Schiltrons was now fleeing the field. And suddenly, the English army found itself in a nightmare. Their cavalry trapped, their infantry crushed together, their archers scattered, and the Scottish army still advancing. The battle was far from over, but the momentum had begun to shift, and somewhere within the English ranks, the first whispers of fear were beginning to spread. By late morning, the battlefield near Bannockburn had become something almost unrecognizable. What had begun as organized lines and confident charges had dissolved into a suffocating mass of struggling men, fallen horses, broken weapons, and shouted orders that no one could properly hear anymore. Dust hung thick in the air, mixing with the smell of sweat, mud, blood, and iron. The English army was still enormous, but its strength had become its greatest weakness. Thousands of soldiers were now packed tightly into the narrow strip of land between the Bannockburn and the woods of New Park. Men in the rear kept pushing forward, unaware of the disaster unfolding at the front. They could not see the shattered cavalry charges, the fallen horses blocking the ground, or the relentless spear walls slowly forcing their way forward. All they felt was pressure, bodies pressing against bodies, shields jammed against backs, armor grinding against armor. The heat inside that living mass became unbearable. Many English soldiers wore heavy chainmail or plate armor designed for protection, but now that same armor turned into a prison. Under the rising sun, the metal grew hot, trapping sweat and suffocating the men wearing it. Some soldiers began collapsing simply from exhaustion. When one man fell, there was often no room for him to get back up. He was simply trampled to the very front of the chaos. The Scottish Schiltrons continued their relentless advance. The formations moved with frightening discipline, step after step, spear after spear, never breaking apart. The men inside them had trained for this moment, and now their determination was slowly grinding down the enemy. English knights who had fallen from their horses tried desperately to fight on foot, swinging swords and axes against the forest of spears. But every step forward brought another stab, another thrust of sharpened steel. Many knights were simply overwhelmed by the sheer number of spear points surrounding them. Behind them, the battlefield grew more desperate by the minute. Commanders tried to rally their troops, shouting orders to regroup or pull back to better ground. But communication was nearly impossible. The noise alone was overwhelming. Horses screamed, men shouted, metal crashed against metal, and somewhere above it all, the constant roar of thousands of voices blended into something like the sound of storm. King Edward II himself watched the chaos unfolding from a position behind the main fighting. What he saw must have been deeply unsettling. The army that had marched north so confidently was now tangled and struggling in terrain that seemed almost designed to destroy it. The cavalry had lost its momentum. The archers had been driven away, and the infantry at the front were being pushed back by the advancing Scottish formations. Still, the English army was large enough that the battle might yet turn. But Robert the Bruce had been waiting for the perfect moment. Until now, he had held back part of his forces, fresh troops who had not yet entered the brutal fighting. These were the warriors of Argyll, led by Angus O.G. MacDonald, fierce fighters from the Western Highlands who had marched to Bannockburn determined to prove themselves. They had been watching the battle from behind the Scottish lines, waiting for the signal. Finally, Bruce gave the order. The reserve surged forward. Compared to the exhausted English soldiers who had been fighting for hours, these men were fresh, energized, and eager for battle. As they advanced on a battlefield, they crashed directly into the already strained English front lines. For the English soldiers struggling in the crushing mass of bodies, it felt as though a completely new army had suddenly appeared. The pressure increased instantly. Scottish spears pushed harder. the Schiltrons advanced faster. English soldiers who had been barely holding their ground suddenly found themselves being forced backward step by step. And then something happened that changed everything. High on a nearby hill, a strange sight began to appear. Figures started emerging over the crest of the ridge. Dozens at first, then hundreds. They carried banners, tools, sticks, and whatever weapons they could find. From a distance, they looked like another army arriving to join the battle. But they were not soldiers. They were the Scottish camp followers, servants, cooks, blacksmiths, wagon drivers, and other non-combatants who had been watching the battle from the hills. When they saw the English army beginning to falter, excitement and courage swept through them. Many grabbed anything that resembled a weapon and rushed toward the battlefield, eager to join what they believed was the final push. From their position on the hill, their numbers looked far larger than they actually were. The exhausted English soldiers already struggling to survive. The sight was devastating. Suddenly it appeared as though yet another wave of Scottish reinforcements was descending upon them. Whispers spread through the ranks, then shouts. Treachery. More Scots. We're surrounded. Panic is a strange force in battle. Armies can endure incredible hardship as long as soldiers believe they still have a chance to win. But the moment doubt takes hold, even the strongest forces can collapse with shocking speed. And doubt was now spreading through the English army like wildfire. Some soldiers began turning around, trying to push their way out of the crushing mass. Others dropped their weapons entirely, desperate simply to escape the chaos. The tightly packed formation that had once been a powerful army began unraveling. When the first groups started retreating, the effect multiplied instantly. Retreat turned into confusion. Confusion turned into fear. And fear turned into full panic. Somewhere amid the chaos, someone shouted the word that every army dreads. Retreat. Whether it was an official command or simply the desperate cry of a frightened soldier hardly mattered anymore. The effect was immediate. The English army broke. What had once been an organized military force began dissolving into a desperate crowd of men trying to escape the battlefield as fast as possible. King Edward II's bodyguards realized the danger immediately. If the king were captured or killed, the consequences would be catastrophic. They grabbed his horse and forced him away from the battlefield, escorting him south as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, thousands of English soldiers tried to flee the same way they had come, but the narrow ground that had trapped them during the battle now turned their retreat into disaster. Behind them lay the Bannockburn, and the stream that had seemed so small and insignificant the day before was about to become a deadly barrier. What began as a retreat quickly turned into a desperate stampede. The moment the English lines broke, discipline vanished almost instantly. Thousands of soldiers who had been locked together in that suffocating crush suddenly began trying to move in the opposite direction all at once. Men shoved past one another, shouting, stumbling, pushing desperately toward any space that might lead them away from the advancing Scottish spears. But the battlefield offered almost no escape. The same narrow ground that had trapped the English during the battle now became a deadly funnel. Every soldier was trying to flee along the same routes, toward the same crossings over the Bannockburn. Horses without riders bolted wildly through the crowd. Knights struggled to control their mounts as terrified infantrymen grabbed at them, trying to pull themselves up and escape faster. Behind them, the Scottish army surged forward. For the Scots, the moment was electric. For hours they had fought against overwhelming numbers, holding the line while waves of armored enemies crashed against their spears. Now, suddenly, the giant English army that had marched north so confidently was running. And once an army begins to run, it becomes incredibly vulnerable. Scottish soldiers shouted war cries as they pressed forward. Spears jabbed at the backs of fleeing infantry. Light cavalry galloped through the edges of the collapsing English lines, cutting down isolated groups of soldiers trying to escape. Ahead of the fleeing English troops lay the Bannockburn. Under normal circumstances, it was nothing more than a modest stream winding across the land. But after hours of battle and thousands of men rushing toward it at once, it quickly became something far more dangerous. The banks were muddy and steep in many places. Horses slipped as riders tried to force them down the slopes. Infantry stumbled into the water, colliding with one another in the panic. Some men tried to wade across. Others attempted to swim. Many were still wearing full armor, and that armor, which had been designed to protect them in battle, now became a deadly burden. A knight in full gear could weigh more than twice as much as an unarmored man. Once they slipped into deep water, the weight dragged them downward like stones. Men thrashed desperately in the stream, clawing at each other in their attempts to stay above the surface. Some grabbed onto horses, pulling both themselves and the animals down. Others were pushed under by the sheer pressure of bodies behind them. The water churned with mud, armor, and panic, and all around them the Scottish army continued to close in. Many English soldiers simply threw away their weapons and armor in desperation, hoping the lighter weight would allow them to run faster. Swords, shields, and helmets scattered across the ground as men fled across fields and marshes. But escape was not easy. The terrain that Bruce had chosen so carefully now worked against the fleeing army. Marshy ground slowed them down. Fallen horses and bodies blocked paths. Groups of soldiers collided with one another in their frantic attempts to find safety. Meanwhile, the Scots continued their pursuit. For them, the moment carried years of anger and frustration. They had lived through English occupation, seen villages burned, and watched leaders executed. Now the enemy that had dominated their land for so long was breaking apart before their eyes. Some English soldiers managed to escape southward in scattered groups, but many others were surrounded and captured. Noblemen in particular became valuable prizes. A captured noble could be ransomed for enormous sums of money, sometimes enough to fund entire military campaigns. Robert the Bruce understood this very well. His soldiers were encouraged to capture nobles whenever possible rather than killing them outright. Still, the chaos of the rout meant many died before they could surrender. Across the battlefield, the scale of the disaster became clear. Thousands of English soldiers had been killed during the battle and the retreat. Others lay wounded among the wreckage of armor and weapons scattered across the field. Entire noble families had lost sons and brothers in the fighting. What had begun as a confident invasion had turned into one of the most humiliating defeats England had suffered in generations. Meanwhile, King Edward II was fleeing for his life. His bodyguards pushed him south as quickly as possible, avoiding the main roads whenever they could. The king's escape was not glorious. There were no banners or triumphant horns, only a small group of exhausted riders trying desperately to stay ahead of the pursuing Scots. Eventually, Edward would reach safety behind the walls of English-held castles, but the damage had already been done. Behind him lay a shattered army and a battlefield that would soon become legendary. Yes, the fighting faded and the noise of battle slowly died away. The Scottish soldiers began to realize what they had accomplished: 6,000 men against an army of 20,000, and they had won. The victory at Bannockburn was not just another battlefield success. It was something far greater. For years, the English had seemed unstoppable. Their knights dominated medieval warfare. Their armies were larger and better equipped, and their kings had believed Scotland would remain under English control forever. But Bannockburn shattered that belief. That it proved that discipline, tactics, and the right battlefield could defeat even the most powerful armies. It proved that the Scottish kingdom was not finished. And it proved that Robert the Bruce was no longer merely a rebel noble with a crown and no land, that he was now, beyond any doubt, the king of Scotland. When the sounds of battle finally faded and the dust began to settle over the fields near the Bannockburn, the full scale of what had happened slowly revealed itself. What had been, only hours earlier, one of the most powerful armies England had assembled in years now lay scattered across the landscape in broken pieces. Armor, weapons, shattered lances, fallen banners, and abandoned shields covered the ground. Horses wandered riderless across the field, some injured, some simply exhausted and confused, and everywhere were the signs of the battle's terrible cost. Thousands of English soldiers had died that day, some in the brutal fighting against the advancing spear walls, others during the chaotic retreat when panic had driven them into the waters of the Bannockburn or into the blades of pursuing Scots. The exact number would never be known, But chroniclers of the time estimated that more than 4,000 English soldiers lost their lives. For the Scots, the losses were far smaller. Fewer than 500 men had fallen. It was an outcome so shocking that even many Scottish soldiers could hardly believe it as they walked among the battlefield in the hours after the fighting ended. Only the day before, they had been facing an army that outnumbered them nearly 4-1. An army filled with knights whose reputation for dominance on medieval battlefields was legendary. And yet the impossible had happened. The English army had not merely been defeated, it had been shattered. Among the survivors captured on the field were dozens of English nobles. Knights, lords, and wealthy landowners who had marched north expecting victory now found themselves prisoners of the Scottish king. In medieval warfare, this was not simply a matter of humiliation, it was also a matter of wealth. Noble prisoners could be ransomed for enormous sums of money. Families would pay huge amounts to secure the return of captured sons and brothers. Robert the Bruce understood the value of this perfectly. The ransoms collected after Bannockburn would pour vast resources into the Scottish treasury, strengthening the kingdom financially for years to come. Meanwhile, word of the battle spread quickly across Britain. Messengers carried the news southward, passing through towns and villages where people gathered in disbelief as they heard what had happened. An English army of 20,000 men had been defeated by a much smaller Scottish force. Even more astonishing, the English king himself had fled the battlefield. For England, the defeat was deeply embarrassing. The campaign that had been intended to crush the Scottish rebellion had instead become one of the most famous military disasters of the Middle Ages. Questions began to circulate among English nobles about how such a defeat had been possible. For Scotland, however, the victory carried a completely different meaning. It was proof that England was not invincible. Proof that Scotland could fight and win. Proof that Robert the Bruce truly was the rightful king of a free kingdom in the days following the battle. Bruce moved quickly to secure the advantages gained at Bannockburn. Stirling Castle, the fortress that had triggered the entire confrontation, soon surrendered exactly as the earlier agreement had promised. The English garrison had no choice but to hand over the keys once it became clear that no rescue would arrive. With Stirling now under Scottish control, the strategic balance across the country shifted dramatically. The fortress had been the gateway between northern and southern Scotland. Without it, English forces would find it far more difficult to launch future invasions. But the war itself was not completely over. England still possessed vast resources, and many English nobles were not ready to abandon their claim over Scotland so easily. For several more years, fighting continued across the borderlands. Raids and counterattacks flared along the frontier as both kingdoms tested each other's strength. Yet the momentum had clearly changed. Before Bannockburn, England had seemed unstoppable. After Bannockburn, the situation was very different. Scottish forces even began launching their own raids into northern England, forcing English commanders to defend their own lands rather than focusing entirely on conquest. Robert the Bruce had transformed the conflict. What had once been a desperate rebellion had become a war between two kingdoms. And slowly, year by year, the political reality began to shift across Europe. Other rulers started recognizing Bruce as the legitimate king of Scotland. Diplomatic efforts strengthened Scotland's position. Even the church, which had once excommunicated Bruce for the killing inside the church years earlier, gradually softened its stance as his power became undeniable. 14 years after the Battle of Bannockburn, the long struggle finally reached its official conclusion. In the year 1328, England signed the Treaty of Edinburgh, Northampton in that agreement. The English crown formally recognized Scotland as an independent kingdom. Robert the Bruce, the man who had once been mocked as a king without a kingdom, was now acknowledged across Europe as the rightful ruler of a free nation. Bannockburn had made that possible. Historians would look back on the battle for centuries as one of the greatest military upsets of the medieval world. 6,000 Scots defeating 20,000 English soldiers. But the victory was never just about numbers. It was about leadership, about understanding terrain, about discipline and preparation. Robert the Bruce had chosen the battlefield carefully, trained his soldiers relentlessly, and turned the English army's strengths against itself. He had refused to fight on the enemy's terms and instead forced them into a situation where their numbers and heavy cavalry became liabilities rather than advantages. The battle also became a symbol for Scotland itself, that a moment when a smaller force stood against overwhelming odds and refused to break. Even today, more than 700 years later, the story of Bannockburn still echoes through history. The fields where the battle took place have long since grown quiet again. The rivers flow as peacefully as they once did, and the armies that clashed there exist only in memory. But the lesson of that June morning in 1314 remains unforgettable. Sometimes the outcome of history does not belong to the strongest army. Sometimes it belongs to the side that refuses to give up. And on those narrow fields beside the Bannockburn, 6,000 Scots proved exactly that. The field around Bannockburn slowly returned to silence. The cries of battle faded. The dust settled, and the stream that had carried so many fleeing soldiers away flowed quietly again, as if nothing extraordinary had happened there at all. But for the people of Scotland, nothing would ever be the same. Robert the Bruce stood on ground that had just rewritten the fate of his kingdom. Only a few years earlier, he had been a hunted man, chased across mountains and islands with barely a handful of followers. His enemies had called him a murderer, an outlaw, a king with no kingdom. English commanders had believed his rebellion would collapse sooner or later, like so many before it. But now the truth was impossible to ignore. He had just defeated the greatest army England had sent north in decades. And more importantly, he had done it in a way that shattered the myth of English invincibility. In the days following the battle, Scottish soldiers spread out across the countryside, securing the region and gathering prisoners. Many of the captured nobles were escorted under guard, treated carefully but firmly. Their families would soon be sending messages and negotiations, offering enormous ransoms to secure their safe return. These ransoms became one of Bruce's greatest rewards from the battle. Medieval warfare was not only about victory or defeat. It was also about wealth, and the prisoners taken at Bannockburn were incredibly valuable. The money paid for their release would fund new campaigns, strengthen the Scottish crown, and help rebuild lands that had suffered through years of war. But Bruce did not allow the victory to turn into complacency. He knew something many warriors forget after a great triumph. Winning one battle does not end a war. England was still powerful. Its population was far larger than Scotland's, its treasury deeper, and its kings would never easily accept the humiliation of Bannockburn. If Bruce allowed the English time to recover and organize, another army could eventually march north again. Instead of waiting for the next invasion, Bruce did something bold. He carried the war south. Scottish forces began launching raids deep into northern England. Fast-moving groups of riders crossed the border, striking towns, farms, and supply depots before disappearing again into the hills. These raids were not meant to conquer England, but to force English leaders to focus on defending their own lands rather than planning new invasions of Scotland. For English villagers living near the border, these sudden attacks were terrifying. Scottish riders appeared with little warning, moving quickly and vanishing just as fast. Food, livestock, and supplies were taken back north. Strengthening Scotland while weakening England, was the same kind of warfare Bruce had once used as a desperate rebel. Now he used it as a king. Over the next several years, the balance of power slowly shifted. Scottish control over their own territory grew stronger, and English influence faded from many parts of the country. Castle after castle that had once flown the banner of England now raised the Lion of Scotland instead. But even as Bruce strengthened his kingdom, the memory of the long struggle remained fresh in everyone's mind. The people of Scotland had not forgotten the earlier years of the war. They remembered the villages burned by invading armies. They remembered the nobles forced to swear loyalty to foreign kings. And they remembered a man who had fought for Scotland before Bruce ever wore a crown on a man, whose name had once struck fear into English commanders, William Wallace. Though Wallace had been dead for years before Bannockburn, his legend still lived in every corner of Scotland. Stories of his rebellion passed from village to village, told around fires in long winter nights. Children grew up hearing about the giant warrior who had defeated English forces at Stirling Bridge and dared to challenge the might of King Edward I. His death had been brutal, meant to destroy hope. Instead, it had done the opposite. Wallace had become something more powerful than a living leader. He had become a symbol. And in many ways, Bannockburn felt like the moment when that symbol finally came full circle. The struggle Wallace began had now reached its greatest victory under Robert the Bruce. But history rarely moves in straight lines. Even after Bannockburn, even after years of victories and growing independence, the fate of Scotland would still face new challenges. Wars would continue, alliances would shift, and future generations would again be forced to defend the freedom won on that battlefield. Because the story of Scotland's fight for independence did not begin with Bannockburn, and it did not end there either, did I. In fact, to truly understand how a small kingdom managed to resist one of the most powerful nations in medieval Europe, we have to go back once more to the early days of rebellion, to the moment when an ordinary man first picked up a sword and ignited the fire of resistance, that a fire that would eventually lead, years later, to the victory at Bannockburn. And that man was William Wallace. Long before the victory at Bannockburn, long before Robert the Bruce became the king who would free Scotland, the land was already simmering with anger. The English occupation had not arrived quietly. When King Edward I forced his authority over Scotland in the late 1200s, it was done with a heavy hand. Castles were seized, nobles were forced to swear loyalty, and English officials began ruling Scottish lands as if they were simply another part of England. For many ordinary people in Scotland, life became harsher almost overnight. Taxes increased. English soldiers appeared in towns and villages that had once been governed by Scottish lords. And perhaps worst of all, the pride of an independent kingdom began to disappear under foreign control. But resentment does not vanish just because it is suppressed. It waits. It builds quietly beneath the surface like pressure inside a sealed vessel. And eventually, something always causes it to explode. That in the 1290s Scotland was already unstable. The Scottish throne had become the center of a complicated crisis after the death of King Alexander III. Without a clear heir, powerful noble families began competing for control. The situation grew so tense that Edward I of England stepped in as a so-called mediator, claiming he would help choose Scotland's next king. But Edward had no intention of acting as a neutral judge. Instead, he used the opportunity to assert dominance over the country itself. The man ultimately placed on the Scottish throne was John Balliol, but Edward treated him more like a puppet than a king. Balliol was forced to follow English commands, and many Scottish nobles quickly realized that their country had effectively become subordinate to England. Eventually, Balliol and the Scottish leadership tried to resist. Edward responded with overwhelming force. English armies marched north, crushing resistance wherever it appeared. Scottish forces were defeated, cities were captured, and Balliol himself was stripped of his crown and taken into English custody. The message was clear. Scotland was no longer a kingdom, that it was a possession. English garrisons were placed across the country to maintain control. Sheriffs loyal to England governed towns and collected taxes. For a time, it seemed that resistance had been completely broken. But revolutions rarely begin in royal courts or noble halls. More often, they begin somewhere far quieter, in villages, on farms. Among ordinary people who simply reach the point where they refuse to accept things as they are any longer. Somewhere in the countryside of southwestern Scotland, around this time, lived a man whose name would soon become known across the entire kingdom. William Wallace. Unlike Robert the Bruce, Wallace did not come from the highest ranks of the Scottish nobility. His family held land, but they were not among the great lords who competed for the throne. That difference would later become important, because Wallace was seen not just as a noble leader, but as a champion of ordinary Scots. The details of his early life are difficult to know with certainty. Medieval records were often incomplete, and over the centuries, many stories about Wallace grew larger and more dramatic as legends spread from generation to generation. But what is clear is this to be why the late 1290s, Wallace had become one of the most dangerous enemies of English rule in Scotland. The rebellion began small. Small groups of Scottish fighters started attacking isolated English patrols, supply wagons, and officials. These were not massive battles, but sudden strikes carried out by men who knew the land far better than the occupying soldiers. English authority in some regions began to weaken as these attacks increased. And Wallace quickly proved himself to be a skilled leader. He moved quickly across the countryside, gathering followers and striking where English forces were weakest. His fighters relied on speed and surprise rather than traditional battlefield tactics. Roads became dangerous for English messengers. Small garrisons suddenly found themselves under attack in the middle of the night. As word of these successes spread, more men joined Wallace's growing force. Farmers brought axes and spears. Hunters brought bows. Local warriors who had once served Scottish lords now found a new leader in Wallace. The rebellion was spreading. English officials soon realized something serious was happening. What had begun as scattered acts of resistance was turning into a full uprising. Garrisons that had once felt secure now began sending urgent reports south to their commanders. One message appeared again and again. The same name, Wallace. English forces attempted to capture him, but Wallace proved frustratingly difficult to track down. He moved constantly, striking quickly and disappearing before larger armies could arrive. In the summer of 1297, the rebellion reached a turning point. Scottish forces under Wallace and another leader, Andrew Moray, began gathering near one of the most strategically important crossings in the entire country, a place that would soon become famous across medieval Europe, Stirling Bridge. The bridge crossed the River Forth, one of the major natural barriers in Scotland. Whoever controlled that crossing controlled movement between northern and southern parts of the country. When English commanders heard that Scottish rebels had gathered nearby, they moved to confront them with a powerful army. They believed they would crush the rebellion in a single decisive battle. But William Wallace had other plans, because just like Robert the Bruce years later at Bannockburn, Wallace understood something that many powerful commanders overlooked. Battles are not always won by the larger army. Sometimes they are won by the side that chooses the ground. And at Stirling Bridge, Wallace had chosen very carefully to narrow crossing to a powerful river, in an English army that would soon discover it had walked straight into a trap. The River Forth wound through the Scottish landscape like a long silver ribbon, wide and slow in some places, narrow and swift in others. Near the town of Stirling, it formed one of the most important natural barriers in the entire kingdom. Anyone traveling between the north and south of Scotland had to cross it somewhere, and the safest crossing point was a wooden bridge that stretched across the river's narrower section. Stirling Bridge was not a large bridge, and that was exactly what made it important. Only a small number of men could cross it at once an army commander who understood terrain. That simple fact could turn an entire battlefield into a weapon. That be why the late summer of 1297, William Wallace and Andrew Moray had gathered their growing Scottish forces near this crossing. Their army was still smaller than the one marching against them, but it had something far more valuable than numbers that had position. The Scottish fighters camped on higher ground near the northern side of the river. From there, they could see the English forces assembling across the water. The English army was strong, disciplined, and well-equipped. Knights in heavy armor waited alongside infantry and archers, all confident that this rebellion would soon be crushed like so many others. Leading the English forces were experienced commanders who believed they held every advantage. After all, they were facing what they saw as a rebel force made up mostly of farmers and irregular fighters. Once their army crossed the river, they expected the Scots to break quickly. But crossing the river was the problem. The bridge allowed only a small number of soldiers to pass at any one time. If the entire English army attempted to cross together, the line would stretch out dangerously long, with some men already across while others were still waiting on the far side. Some English officers noticed the danger immediately. They advised caution, suggesting the army search for another crossing point or construct a temporary bridge that would allow them to move more safely. But patience is not always a strength in war. English commanders believed the Scottish rebels would eventually retreat if they waited too long. And the idea that this army of farmers and rebels could actually defeat a professional English force seemed ridiculous to many of them. They made a decision. They would cross the bridge. Slowly, the English soldiers began marching across Stirling Bridge. First, it looked like an ordinary movement of troops. Knights led the way, followed by infantry carrying shields and spears. The bridge creaked under the weight of armor and horses as the line continued forward. From their position on the hill, Wallace and Moray watched silently. They gave no signal to attack. Not yet. More English soldiers crossed the bridge. Hundreds of them now stood on the northern side of the river, spreading out across the flat ground near the water. Behind them, the rest of the army continued moving forward in a long column that stretched back across the bridge. Still, the Scots waited. The English soldiers on the northern side began forming ranks, preparing to advance toward the Scottish position. From their perspective, the situation still seemed completely manageable. Yes, the bridge slowed their movement, but once enough troops had crossed, the rebels would be easily overwhelmed. Then Wallace made his move. He waited until a large portion of the English army had crossed, but many more were still trapped on the narrow bridge behind them. And then he gave the signal. The Scottish army surged forward. War cries exploded across the hillside as hundreds of fighters charged down toward the English soldiers near the river. The sudden attack caught them completely off guard. Many had not even fully formed their ranks when the Scots slammed into them. The effect was immediate chaos. English soldiers who had just crossed the bridge suddenly found themselves facing a furious assault from a determined enemy. Behind them, the bridge was still packed with more troops trying to cross. There was no easy way to retreat, no room to reorganize, and the Scots were attacking with incredible force. Spears drove forward into the confused English lines. Axes and swords flashed in the sunlight as the Scottish fighters pushed toward the riverbank. The English soldiers tried to hold their ground, but they were trapped between the attacking Scots and the crowded bridge behind them. Then the situation became even worse. Some Scottish fighters pushed directly toward the bridge itself. If they could block or destroy it, the English army would be split in two. That men still on the southern side would be unable to help their comrades who had already crossed. And that is exactly what happened. That as the fighting intensified near the bridge, panic began, spreading among the English soldiers trapped on the northern bank. Some tried to push their way back across the bridge, colliding with the troops still marching forward. The narrow crossing became a chaotic jam of men and horses struggling in opposite directions. Others attempted a far more dangerous escape. They tried to swim across the river, but the river Forth was deeper and faster than it looked. Soldiers wearing armor quickly found themselves dragged beneath the water. The weight of their equipment pulled them down, and many drowned before reaching the other side. Meanwhile, the Scottish fighters continued pressing the attack. The English commander on the northern side, Hugh de Cressingham, fought desperately to restore order. But the situation was already slipping beyond control. Surrounded by enemies and cut off from much of his army, his forces were slowly being overwhelmed. The battle had turned into a trap. Exactly the trap Wallace had planned. And soon, the English army would realize that what they had believed would be an easy victory had instead become one of the most humiliating defeats they had ever suffered on Scottish soil. The chaos on the northern side of Stirling Bridge only grew as the Scottish attack intensified. English soldiers were trapped between two forces, those already across the bridge, trying to hold their ground, and the fresh wave of Scottish fighters pouring down from the hills. Horses whinnied in panic. Men shouted orders that went unheard. Spears and axes clashed. The narrow space, which had once seemed manageable to the English commanders, had turned into a deadly choke point. Anyone who tried to flee backward across the bridge collided with men still pushing forward, creating a tangle of soldiers, horses, and armor that slowed everyone down in the middle of this chaos. Wallace moved with remarkable presence. Mounted on a small horse, wearing simple armor, he was almost invisible amid the frenzy of combat, but his influence was everywhere. He shouted orders, encouraged his men, and moved along the lines to rally those who faltered. Every time an English soldier tried to regroup, a Scottish fighter would push back harder, cutting off escape routes and driving them closer to the river. Hugh de Cressingham, the English treasurer and commander, realized too late the danger of the terrain and Wallace's tactical genius. The English army, once confident, now faced panic. Men began retreating in disorder. The narrow bridge made escape almost impossible. Some plunged into the river Forth, only to be dragged under by the weight of armor and equipment. Others were cut down by spears, swords, and arrows as they tried desperately to regroup. Within hours, the battlefield was completely dominated by the Scots. Hundreds of English soldiers had fallen, and the survivors were either captured or fled in terror. The defeat was decisive, shocking, and humiliating. For Wallace and Moray, it was not just a military victory. It was proof that Scotland could resist English domination. News of the victory spread like wildfire across Scotland. Village célébrated. Farmers, merchants, and townspeople saw that rebellion was possible. The Scottish morale soared. Wallace became a symbol of freedom, a figure who embodied courage, ingenuity, and the determination of ordinary men fighting for their homeland. The battle also sent shockwaves into England. King Edward I, who had believed the rebellion would be crushed, now had to confront the reality that his forces had been decisively beaten by a smaller, less equipped army. His officers questioned strategy, and morale plummeted. For the Scots, Stirling Bridge was not just a victory. It was a turning point in the struggle for independence. Wallace did not rest on his laurels. In the months following Stirling Bridge, he continued leading raids into northern England, disrupting supply lines and gathering more men to his cause. The rebellion he had ignited spread, proving that resistance was not only possible but sustainable. His reputation grew across Europe, and stories of his daring and tactical brilliance began to inspire others far beyond Scotland's borders. Yet, as with all legends, Wallace's path would not remain without danger. The English crown would not forget this humiliation, and over the coming years, they would seek revenge. Betrayals, political intrigue, and overwhelming military force would eventually confront Wallace. But the victories at Stirling Bridge and the growing legend of William Wallace set the stage for the next chapter of Scotland's fight for freedom. A chapter that would see the rise of another man who would continue the struggle where Wallace left off. That man, of course, was Robert the Bruce. The spark Wallace had ignited would fuel Bruce's rise and eventually lead to the epic confrontation at Bannockburn, where Scotland would finally cement its independence in a battle that would echo through history. After the triumphant victory at Stirling Bridge, William Wallace became the most feared and admired man in Scotland. He was no longer just a rebel. He was the guardian of Scotland, leading raids deep into northern England, striking fear into garrisons and demonstrating that the English crown could be challenged. Every success strengthened Scottish morale and spread the legend of a man who refused to bow to foreign rule. But as his fame grew, so did the determination of King Edward I to crush him. The English king had a long memory for humiliation, and Wallace had inflicted one that would not be forgotten. Edward marshaled new forces, promising rewards to those who could capture the Scottish hero. Wallace, ever cautious and clever, avoided open confrontation when necessary. He continued leading guerrilla raids, exploiting his intimate knowledge of the terrain and the mobility of his men. Forests, hills, and rivers became his allies. But while he was a master of the battlefield, politics was less his domain. Scotland's noble factions were divided, many uncertain whether to support Wallace, Robert the Bruce, or submit to English rule. Eventually, betrayal struck. In 1305, Wallace was captured near Glasgow through a conspiracy orchestrated by a Scottish noble loyal to England. The man who had eluded the might of the English army for years, who had outwitted knights and generals, was taken prisoner in a quiet, unsuspecting moment. Wallace was brought to London, where the English intended to make an example of him. His trial was brutal, a spectacle meant to terrorize anyone who dared defy the crown. He was accused of treason, though to Wallace, and to most Scots, loyalty to Scotland was no crime. The judgment was predetermined, and the sentence was horrific that on August 23, 1305, William Wallace was executed. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, a punishment designed to make the pain last and the warning clear. His body was displayed in multiple locations across England as a message. This was the fate of those who dared defy the king. Yet the English had miscalculated. Instead of destroying hope, Wallace's death ignited it. Stories of his bravery, ingenuity, and devotion to Scotland spread, even more widely. Across villages and towns, people told tales of the man who had defied England, inspiring a generation to continue the struggle he had begun. Among those inspired was Robert the Bruce. Bruce had already begun plotting his return to power, but Wallace's legend gave him a blueprint of courage, tactical cunning, and the importance of Scottish unity. Wallace showed that even a smaller, determined force could strike decisive blows against a stronger enemy, a lesson Bruce would take to heart. Over the next decade, the fight for Scottish independence continued. Bruce moved carefully, reclaiming lands, forging alliances, and ultimately consolidating power. He learned from Wallace's victories and mistakes, combining guerrilla tactics with conventional warfare, preparing for the moment when Scotland would face England in open battle once more. Wallace had fallen, but his spirit had survived. The fire he lit in the hearts of the Scottish people was now being carried forward by Robert the Bruce. And when the armies finally met again at Bannockburn, it was Wallace's legacy that echoed in every spear thrust, every strategic maneuver, and every roar of the Scottish soldiers. The struggle for Scotland's freedom was far from over, but one thing was certain. The courage of one man could inspire a nation to fight for centuries, and no chain of oppression could extinguish the desire for liberty. With William Wallace gone, Scotland entered a period of uncertainty. The English still occupied much of the land, and Scottish nobles were divided, some loyal to England, others secretly supporting the cause of freedom. Amid this turmoil, one man quietly began plotting his return. Robert the Bruce. Bruce had once been a young noble caught in the dangerous game of Scottish politics. He had claimed the throne in 1306, committing a shocking act of sacrilege by killing his rival in a church. The act made him a fugitive almost overnight. Excommunicated by the church, hunted by English forces, and abandoned by many of his own allies, Bruce had been forced into hiding. For years, he moved across Scotland like a shadow. Mountains, forests, and remote islands became his refuge. Small bands of loyal followers accompanied him, often outnumbered and outmatched. Yet Bruce survived, learning to fight not as a conventional king commanding armies, but as a guerrilla leader, moving quickly, striking unpredictably, and disappearing before the enemy could respond. It was a dangerous period, full of narrow escapes and betrayal. English patrols scoured the countryside for him. Nobles who feared English retaliation betrayed friends to protect themselves. But Bruce was patient. He understood that rushing back into open conflict would mean certain death. He studied the land, learned from past Scottish rebellions, including the strategies Wallace had used, and waited for the right moment. That moment gradually came. By carefully building alliances, Bruce reclaimed support from key Scottish clans. He promised protection, rewards, and the restoration of their lands, winning over nobles who had previously been hesitant. Small victories followed. One castle after another returned to Scottish control. Each win strengthened Bruce's reputation and proved that he could lead not only through cunning, but also through courage. Bruce also learned the importance of battlefield tactics, studying the mistakes of the English and the strengths of Scottish fighters. He adopted the Schiltron formation, a tight circle of spearmen designed to repel cavalry, an innovation that would later prove decisive at Bannockburn. He fortified positions near rivers and forests, using terrain to neutralize the English advantage in heavy cavalry and numbers. Slowly, year by year, Bruce transformed from a hunted fugitive into the undisputed king of Scots in practice, even as some English still refused to recognize him. His army grew, composed of veterans who had survived years of fighting, clans loyal to his cause, and ordinary men inspired by the possibility of freedom. By the time he was ready to confront Edward II's forces at Bannockburn, Bruce had turned patience, cunning, and experience into a powerful weapon. Every battle he had avoided or survived during those years in hiding had a purpose. Every castle reclaimed strength and morale. Every alliance forged among clans increased his ability to confront England on his terms. And all the while, the memory of Wallace loomed large. Bruce knew that the man who had struck the first true blow against England had done more than fight battles. He had inspired a nation. Bruce carried that inspiration forward, combining it with strategy, leadership, and timing, preparing to face an army that still believed Scotland could be crushed. When the English finally marched north in 1314, they were not just facing Robert the Bruce. They were facing the culmination of years of experience, tactics learned in the shadows, and the spirit of a nation fueled by the memory of Wallace. The stage was set, and on the fields beside the Bannockburn, the story of Scotland's courage, cunning, and resilience would reach its greatest climax. By the spring of 1314, Robert the Bruce had solidified control over most of Scotland. Castles that had once been under English authority were now Scottish. Villages were secure, and alliances with the clans had strengthened his position. Yet one final obstacle remained: Stirling Castle. Stirling was not just any fortress. Strategically placed, it controlled the main route between the northern and southern regions of Scotland. As long as the English held Stirling, Bruce's kingdom would never be fully secure. His brother Edward had been besieging the castle for months, but the English garrison remained determined. Time was critical. The English king, Edward II, would not tolerate the loss of such an important fortress. If the garrison was forced to surrender without a fight, Edward would respond swiftly, bringing one of the largest armies England had ever assembled. Bruce understood the stakes, and he was ready. He selected the battlefield with extraordinary care. A narrow strip of land near the Bannockburn, bordered by thick forests and uneven terrain, was chosen precisely because it neutralized the English numerical advantage. Their heavy cavalry could not deploy effectively here. The Scottish army would fight on their own terms, in secret. Bruce ordered thousands of pits to be dug across the battlefield, covered with branches and grass. These hidden traps were designed to break the charge of horses and throw knights into chaos. It was painstaking work, but Bruce knew the effort would pay off. Every hole was a potential weapon, every trap a deterrent against the superior English cavalry. Meanwhile, the Scottish soldiers trained tirelessly. They formed Schiltrons, tight, circular formations bristling with long spears. Against cavalry, these formations were almost impervious. Horses charged, knights fell, and momentum shifted toward the defenders. Bruce drilled his men constantly, ensuring they could hold formation under pressure, withstand the weight of mounted knights, and strike back at the right moment. Morale was also a focus. Bruce himself led by example, riding among his soldiers, speaking to them, and reminding them of what was at stake. Stories of Wallace's courage were recounted, the victories against England's forces used as a rallying cry. The men understood that they were not just defending their land. They were continuing a legacy of resistance, of freedom, and of Scottish pride. By June, the English were on the march. Edward II had gathered 20,000 men, including thousands of infantry, 2,500 heavily armored knights, and 3,000 Welsh longbowmen. They were confident, believing that a disciplined, professional army would quickly crush the smaller Scottish force. But Bruce had already set his trap. The English would soon learn, as so many had underestimated Scotland before, that numbers alone could not guarantee victory. The Bannockburn was ready. The pits were in place. The Schiltrons were prepared, and the Scots waited, hidden behind their defenses, ready to face the largest English army they had ever encountered. In 2 days, history would be made. The morning of June 23rd, 1314, arrived with a heavy air over the Scottish hills. Mist lingered in the valleys, hiding movements and creating an eerie silence across the Bannockburn. On the narrow strip of land chosen by Robert the Bruce, 6,000 Scots stood ready, weapons sharpened, shields braced, and spears planted firmly in the ground. Every man knew the stakes. Every soldier understood that the fate of Scotland itself would be decided here. Across the hills, the English army appeared, a sea of banners, armor, and men, stretching as far as the eye could see. 20,000 strong, including thousands of foot soldiers, armored knights, and the terrifying Welsh longbowmen. Their armor glinted in the early sunlight, lances were polished, and every commander believed the battle would be theirs in short order. Edward II, young and impatient, rode at the front of his army, eager to crush the Scottish rebellion once and for all. Behind him, the soldiers whispered of their superiority, confident that they were about to finish the fight that Wallace had started and Bruce had prolonged. They had seen larger Scottish armies before. They had faced rebels and guerrilla fighters. And yet, nothing could have prepared them for the reality of Bruce's preparations. Robert the Bruce himself rode forward to inspect his troops. He wore no grand armor, no heavy helmet. Mounted on a small, nimble horse, he carried only a battle axe. Around him, the Schiltrons bristled like living walls of spears, dense formations of men standing shoulder to shoulder, a hedge of pointed steel designed to stop any cavalry charge. Thousands of holes, hidden under grass and branches, awaited the English horses. The stage was set, and every detail had been meticulously planned. The English advanced cautiously, unsure of the terrain. Their heavy cavalry led the way, horses thundering across the field. Lances leveled. Knights shouted. The first wave of English soldiers hit the Scottish lines, expecting the usual retreat, the common tactic against mounted knights. But the Scots did not flinch. The Schiltrons held. Spears met horses, armor met wood, and chaos erupted among the attackers. Horses screamed and fell into hidden pits. Knights were thrown to the ground, and the momentum of the English charge crumbled to that moment. A legendary scene unfolded that would be remembered for centuries. An English knight, Henry de Bohun, spotted Robert the Bruce riding ahead of his men. With the arrogance of a soldier convinced of his victory, Bohun lowered his lance and charged. The King of Scotland, on his small horse, rode directly toward one of England's most feared knights. At the last possible second, Bruce swerved, avoiding the full impact. Standing in his stirrups, he swung his battle axe with unerring precision. The axe struck, splitting Bohun's helmet and skull. The handle shattered, but the blow was decisive. Silence fell for a heartbeat. Then the Scots roared in triumph. Their king had just killed an English champion in single combat, and morale surged like wildfire. Night fell with the English army, still uncertain and shaken. Edward's commanders debated whether to wait, rest their troops, or find higher ground. But Edward was impatient. Stirling Castle's surrender loomed, and he demanded that the attack continue at dawn. It was a fateful decision. The next morning, June 24th, 1314, the English army advanced once more. The narrow terrain forced them to compress their massive force into a confined space. Horses led the charge as usual, but the field was a trap. The first waves of knights crashed into the spear walls of the Schiltrons, unable to break them. Horses stumbled into pits. Soldiers fell upon each other. Archers tried to assist, but the narrow formation made shooting nearly impossible without hitting their own men. Chaos spread like wildfire. For hours, the battle raged in this confined space. Scottish infantry held firm, while Bruce's 500 light cavalry moved with precision, striking at vulnerable English archers and breaking any organized counterattacks. Sweat poured, armor weighed down the exhausted English soldiers, and the corpses began piling so high that men had to climb over the fallen just to reach the fight. Then came the decisive moment. Bruce had held a reserve force, fresh troops from Argyll under Angus OG. They charged into the battle with relentless energy. Simultaneously, the Scottish baggage train, servants, camp followers, armed with whatever they could wield, appeared on the hills. To the exhausted English, it looked like another army. Panic spread instantly. Shouts of treason and retreat filled the air. Edward II barely escaped with his life, dragged from the field by bodyguards. The English army collapsed. What was meant to be an orderly withdrawal became a rout. Soldiers threw down their weapons, armor, anything that slowed them. Many plunged into the Bannockburn, drowning under the weight of their gear. Others were cut down by the pursuing Scots. Entire noble families were wiped out, while thousands more were captured. Scottish losses were minimal, fewer than 500 dead. Bannockburn was more than a battle. It was a statement. England was not invincible. Discipline, clever tactics, and leadership could overcome overwhelming odds. Robert the Bruce had not just defended Scotland. He had secured its freedom. The fields of Bannockburn, once soaked with blood and chaos, slowly fell silent. The cries of battle faded, replaced by the stunned murmur of survivors, Scottish and English alike. For the Scots, it was a moment of triumph unlike any other in their history. They had faced the mightiest army England could muster and emerged victorious, a feat that seemed impossible just days before. The immediate aftermath was grim for the English. Thousands of soldiers had perished on the battlefield or drowned in the Bannockburn. Others were captured, including dozens of nobles and knights whose ransoms would soon fill Scottish coffers. Entire families, proud and powerful in England, were decimated or humiliated. The scale of the disaster sent shockwaves through Edward II's court, and the young king's credibility suffered immensely. His advisors whispered blame. His soldiers feared another campaign against the Scots for Robert the Bruce. The ransoms were more than just wealth. They were a tool to stabilize his kingdom. The money collected from captured nobles funded new fortifications, paid his troops, and provided for the families of soldiers lost during the campaigns. It allowed Bruce to rebuild the infrastructure of Scotland, strengthen loyalty among clans, and ensure that his authority as king was recognized not just by warriors, but by the people of the land. Politically, the victory at Bannockburn changed everything. Scotland was no longer a kingdom teetering on the edge of conquest. It was a nation asserting its independence. English attempts to reclaim Scottish territory slowed dramatically, as their armies were demoralized and stretched thin. Bruce's strategy had not just defeated the English on the battlefield. It had broken the momentum of their military campaigns, leaving Scotland free to consolidate its strength. News of Bannockburn spread across Europe. Ambassadors, merchants, and nobles marveled at the small Scottish army defeating a far larger and better equipped force. The victory inspired other nations to respect Scotland's sovereignty, and it cemented Robert the Bruce as a king not merely in name, but in power and influence. Yet Bruce's work was not finished. England would continue to threaten the northern border, and internal dissent among Scottish nobles still required careful attention. Bruce needed to maintain unity, enforce discipline, and continue showing that Scotland could defend itself. He did so not only through military might, but through diplomacy, forming alliances and ensuring that the clans remained loyal to his rule. Bannockburn also left a psychological legacy. For centuries, English soldiers had considered Scotland a rebellious, but ultimately manageable territory. That perception was shattered. England would never again treat Scotland as a land to be easily subdued. For the Scots, the battle became a symbol of national pride, courage, and resilience. A story passed from generation to generation. In the years that followed, Bruce continued to strengthen Scotland. By 1328, England formally recognized Scottish independence through the Treaty of Edinburgh, Northampton. The recognition was more than a political agreement. It was the formal acknowledgement of the resilience, strategy, and leadership that had begun with Wallace, continued through Bruce's early struggles, and culminated at Bannockburn. Robert the Bruce's legacy endured. He had risen from fugitive and excommunicated noble to a king whose victories secured his nation's freedom. And although the battles had been bloody and the cost of war heavy, the triumph at Bannockburn ensured that the dream Wallace had inspired, a free Scotland, would finally become reality. The story of Bannockburn was not merely a tale of a single battle. It was the story of a nation fighting for its identity, of men and leaders who dared to challenge overwhelming odds, and of the enduring power of courage, strategy, and unity. And in that story, one truth remained clear. From Wallace to Bruce, from rebellion to victory, Scotland's fight for freedom had been relentless, brilliant, and unforgettable. After the smoke cleared from Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce did not simply rest on his laurels. The victory had secured Scotland's independence for the moment, but a kingdom is more than a battlefield. Bruce turned his attention to governance, diplomacy, and the hard work of uniting a nation that had been fractured by years of war, English occupation, and internal rivalries. One of his first priorities was consolidating authority among the clans. Scottish society was fiercely independent, and loyalty could shift like the wind. Bruce rewarded those who had fought at Bannockburn, integrating their support into a structured system of governance. Castles were rebuilt and fortified. Key nobles were granted lands and titles, and the clans were reminded that the king's favor and protection was tied to loyalty. Through a combination of pragmatism and personal charisma, Bruce gradually turned Scotland from a patchwork of semi-autonomous regions into a more cohesive kingdom. Meanwhile, England struggled to recover from the defeat. Edward II had already faced criticism for his leadership, and Bannockburn intensified it. Nobles and commanders questioned his competence, and political instability plagued the English crown. For decades, attempts to reconquer Scotland would be half-hearted, hampered by internal conflicts and the realization that the Scots would no longer be easily subdued. Bannockburn had fundamentally shifted the balance of power in the British Isles. Robert the Bruce also understood the power of legacy. He commissioned chronicles, encouraged storytelling, and cultivated the idea that Scotland's freedom had been won through courage, intelligence, and unity. This was not just a matter of pride. It was a message to England, a warning to future invaders, and an inspiration to the Scottish people themselves. The story of 6,000 men defeating 20,000, the king killing an English champion, the Schiltrons holding firm against cavalry. These were the narratives that would endure Bruce's reign. From 1306 until his death in 1329 was marked by a steady consolidation of power, ongoing campaigns to secure borders, and careful diplomacy with neighboring nations. By the time of his death, Scotland was no longer a rebellious territory at the mercy of England. It was a recognized, independent kingdom with a strong monarch, united clans, and a legacy of resistance that would define its identity for centuries. The psychological and cultural impact of Bannockburn cannot be overstated. For Scots, it became a symbol of what a united people could achieve against overwhelming odds. Every tale of bravery, every story of clever tactics, every moment of perseverance, from Wallace's guerrilla strikes to Bruce's patient strategy, was woven into the fabric of national pride. Schools, bards, and storytellers preserved these events, turning them into legends that shaped Scottish identity long after the battlefields had returned to quiet pastures. For England, Bannockburn was a lesson in humility. No longer could they assume that numerical superiority and heavy armor guaranteed victory. England's kings learned to respect the resilience of the Scots, and for decades, the northern border became a zone of uneasy truce rather than outright domination, i.e. the broader scope of history. The victory at Bannockburn also illustrated the evolution of medieval warfare. It demonstrated how terrain, morale, and tactical innovation could overcome numbers and brute force. The lessons learned on those fields echoed across Europe, influencing future military thinkers and inspiring countless stories of underdog victories. Ultimately, the Battle of Bannockburn was not just the crowning moment of Robert the Bruce. It was the moment Scotland came into its own as a nation. From the early resistance of William Wallace to Bruce's meticulous planning, the fight for freedom had been a journey of resilience, strategy, and indomitable spirit. And for anyone looking back centuries later, the story serves as a powerful reminder. Courage, unity, and determination can change the course of history, no matter the odds. The sun had long set over the fields of Bannockburn, but its shadow stretched across centuries. What Robert the Bruce and his 6,000 men achieved in those 2 days was more than a military victory. It was the forging of a nation's soul. Scotland, once fractured and oppressed, had proven that courage, strategy, and unity could topple even the most powerful armies in Europe. After Bannockburn, Bruce's reign continued with steady determination. He consolidated his kingdom, rebuilt castles, and ensured that the clans were united under a single banner. Diplomacy and careful alliances strengthened Scotland's borders, and the ransoms collected from English captives provided resources to fortify his rule. By 1328, England officially recognized Scotland's independence through the Treaty of Edinburgh, Northampton, formally acknowledging the freedom that Bannockburn had secured on the battlefield. The legacy of Bruce's victory was profound. Stirling and the land surrounding Bannockburn became symbols of resistance, perseverance, and strategic brilliance. Stories of the battle, the Schiltrons holding firm against cavalry, Bruce's personal valor, and the clever use of terrain inspired generations. Scottish identity, already forged in struggle, became inseparable from the idea that freedom could be won even against overwhelming odds. Even beyond Scotland, Bannockburn became a lesson in military history. Commanders studied the importance of terrain, formation, and morale, seeing that an underdog force, well-led and disciplined, could defeat a larger, more equipped army. It was a moment that proved the human spirit and intelligence could bend the course of history, and the human story behind it. The courage of ordinary soldiers, the loyalty of clans, the vision of a king who had once been a fugitive, made Bannockburn more than a battle. It was a story of leadership forged in adversity, of a people rising against oppression, and of the enduring truth that freedom is never given. It is fought for. Robert the Bruce would die in 1329, but the independence he secured, the courage he embodied, and the nation he helped shape endured. William Wallace's earlier rebellion, Wallace's sacrifice, and Bruce's strategic genius together created a lineage of resistance that would resonate in the hearts of Scots for generations. Bannockburn became more than a victory. It became a legend, a story told around fires, in halls, and across centuries. A story of bravery, cunning, and the relentless fight for freedom. From the misty hills where Wallace first fought, to the narrow strip of land beside the Bannockburn where Bruce faced England's finest, the tale of Scotland's rise is a story of determination against the impossible. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, courage, strategy, and unity can turn the tide of history, leaving a legacy that lasts far beyond the battlefield. And so, the echoes of Bannockburn still live on. 6,000 Scots, one king, and a nation forever changed. The end.